if you are anything like me, you probably listen to a lot of true crime.
Oh, yeah.
Constantly.
Right. I mean, there is a whole industry built around these incredibly dark, isolated mysteries. And the transcript we are looking at today for this deep dive, it actually starts exactly like that.
It really does, yeah. It's fascinating.
So the broadcasters on this Dutch news program, which, by the way, originated from a YouTube video by the major daily newspaper De Telegraaf, they're casually chatting about a colleague's hit podcast.
Right.
It's about a Dutch woman who was possibly kidnapped and taken to North Korea. And they are just marveling at how it has surpassed, like, 1 million downloads.
Which makes sense. I mean, it's safe, right? It's distant,
Yeah.
and it's wrapped up in the geopolitical mystery of this impenetrable regime.
Exactly. It's safe.
Yeah.
But then, within literally minutes, the primary speaker, a commentator named Weert, he uses this casual chat as a launch pad to just completely spiral into this sweeping, incredibly dark autopsy of his own country.
Yeah, it's a massive pivot. He goes from the distant mystery of North Korea to declaring the total collapse of Western integration, the surrender of state institutions, and the ideological corruption of the global media. It's a rhetorical whiplash that just forces you to sit up and pay attention.
It is a masterful, if deeply cynical, conversational pivot. What Weert and his co-hosts are constructing here isn't just a daily news commentary. It's a grand, overarching architectural blueprint of a societal collapse.
Yeah.
They're attempting to connect street-level municipal failures directly to global geopolitical narratives, framing it all as symptoms of the exact same terminal disease infecting Western democracies.
Which is quite the claim.
Right. And whether you view this as a brave truth-telling exercise or a dangerous, hyperbolic descent into populism, the mechanics of their argument are just fascinating to take apart.
They really are. But before we jump in, we need to make something crystal clear. The sources you've provided contain highly charged, controversial political opinions touching on race, immigration, the Middle East, and government policy.
Very true.
Yeah. And we are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing these viewpoints. Our job today is purely to act as your guides, to impartially unpack and analyze the arguments being made by the speakers in this transcript so you can understand the mechanics of their worldview.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our goal is to figure out how they connect point A to point Z, not to tell you if they're right or wrong to do so.
Right. We're just looking at the engine.
Yeah, that level of detachment is absolutely necessary for a deep dive like this. If you immediately react defensively or in total agreement, you miss the structural, load-bearing walls of the argument they're building. We need to look at the foundation they're laying, the historical parallels they draw, and the underlying psychology they attribute to both their political enemies and the working-class citizens they claim to represent.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because that initial pivot from North Korea lands us squarely in the middle of a football riot.
Of course it does.
The conversation shifts to the World Cup, specifically a highly charged match between Morocco and France. But the source doesn't care about the score. Weert zeroes in on a very specific recurring phenomenon: Moroccan football fans rioting and tearing up the streets of major European cities.
Right.
And there is a crucial detail here that we cannot gloss over. He specifically identifies these rioters as Berbers. He doesn't just say Moroccans, he isolates a specific ethnic subgroup.
Yeah, that's a very intentional choice.
Why does he make that distinction, and what is the socioeconomic weight of that in a European context?
So that specific linguistic choice is doing a lot of heavy lifting in his argument. In the context of Dutch and broader European migration history, many of the guest workers who arrived from Morocco in the 60s and 70s were from the Rif Mountain region,
Okay.
and they were of Berber descent. Weert is drawing a line between the sophisticated, urban, francophone elite in Moroccan cities like Casablanca and the rural, more culturally conservative populations that largely made up the migration wave to Europe.
Yeah, I see.
By specifically calling them Berbers, he's implying that the European states imported a very specific, deeply insular culture that was already somewhat marginalized in its home country, and then foolishly expected them to seamlessly adopt hyper-progressive Western liberal values.
And according to Weert, the ultimate proof of this failed expectation is the rioting itself.
Exactly.
The kicker for him is that these young men are destroying their own European neighborhoods regardless of the outcome on the pitch. I mean, if Morocco wins, they riot in celebration. If Morocco loses, they riot in anger.
Right. The outcome doesn't matter.
For the speaker, this is the final, undeniable nail in the coffin of the multicultural project. He flat out declares that the Netherlands is now a tribal society.
He uses the riots as undeniable physical evidence of a psychological disconnect. In his view, you do not burn down the bus stops and smash the shop windows of a city you feel a genuine civic ownership over.
Yeah, you just don't.
You only destroy the infrastructure of a place you view as merely a geographical location where you happen to reside, rather than a homeland you're invested in. He argues that the concept of a unified Dutch society is a nostalgic fantasy, and that the reality on the ground is hyper-fragmented. And he specifically broadens this critique beyond the Moroccan community, pointing directly at Syrian, Somali, and Eritrean enclaves, arguing they exist in a total cultural vacuum relative to Dutch society.
I have to pause and challenge the sheer apocalyptic tone of that conclusion, though. Let's say he is entirely correct that these groups have zero connection to traditional Dutch culture.
Yeah.
Couldn't a tribal society still function perfectly well? If we think about human history, empires have managed incredibly diverse, fractured populations for centuries.
Sure.
If you have different neighborhoods, different cultures, but everyone is generally leaving each other alone and abiding by basic laws like parallel train tracks, why does Weert frame this parallel existence as an absolute existential crisis for the nation?
That is the core vulnerability of the parallel society model, and Weirt's underlying thesis addresses it directly. A parallel society, those train tracks you mentioned, it only remains stable if there is a massive, overarching, abstract concept that every single parallel track fundamentally agrees to support.
When? What?
Let's look at the United States as the ultimate case study. The U.S. is deeply tribal. You have insular religious communities, massive Chinatowns, distinct regional identities.
Oh, absolutely.
But the overarching umbrella that keeps the rain off everyone is a shared, almost mythological belief in the American dream, the supremacy of the Constitution, and a unifying civic religion. You can live in a completely parallel cultural universe in the U.S. as long as you pledge allegiance to the overarching framework.
So as long as everyone agrees on the foundational rules of the game, you can wear whatever team jersey you want.
Precisely. But Weirt's argument is that the Dutch state, and by extension, much of Western Europe, they completely forgot to build the umbrella. Yeah. He argues that the European model created a catastrophic asymmetry between rights and duties. The state provided incredible, world-class rights, housing, social benefits, healthcare, and passports. But it demanded absolutely zero duties in return.
No assimilation required.
Right. No enforced cultural assimilation, no mandatory historical education that binds the citizen to the nation. Weir uses the phrase that passports were handed out like sweet rolls.
Which implies they have no inherent value. I mean, if you just stand in line and get a sweet roll, you don't feel a deep patriotic connection to the bakery. You just eat it and walk away.
That is the exact psychological mechanism he's diagnosing. When citizenship is reduced to an administrative transaction rather than a social contract, you get populations that hold the document but possess no internal compass pointing toward the civic health of the nation.
Right.
And this is where his rhetoric escalates from observation to deeply radical policy proposals. Because he believes the social contract is entirely broken, he suggests that traditional outreach or community dialogue is useless.
Yeah, and the solutions he throws out are genuinely shocking in a modern European context.
Very much so.
He suggests the state needs to force people from these specific communities to work under the explicit threat of deportation. He even floats the idea of denaturalization, like stripping actual Dutch citizens of their passports if they refuse to participate in the labor force or integrate.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this, consider the monumental legal and constitutional earthquake it would take for a Western democracy to start revoking citizenship based on labor participation.
The magnitude of that suggestion cannot be overstated. Denaturalization is generally reserved for individuals who commit high treason or join foreign terrorist organizations.
Right.
To suggest applying it to integration failures or welfare dependency reveals a commentator who believes the conventional tools of this state are entirely obsolete. He isn't asking for a tune-up of the integration engine. He is asking to rip the engine out entirely.
That's a great way to put it.
And his justification for this extreme stance is rooted in a fundamental clash of conflict resolution styles. He spends significant time discussing shame and honor cultures.
Right. He contrasts the Western Enlightenment tradition of self-criticism with what he sees in these parallel communities. He argues that in a traditional shame and honor culture, the concept of admitting fault is non-existent because it destroys social standing.
Yeah.
If a Western politician says, our policies failed, it's seen as healthy democratic debate. But Weir claims that if leaders in these communities admit their youth are terrorizing the streets, it's internalized as a catastrophic loss of honor for the entire ethnic group.
Which means, in Weird's worldview, debate is mathematically impossible. If one side views self-reflection as a virtue, and the other side views it as a profound weakness and an attack on their honor, there is no common vocabulary for progress.
You literally can't talk your way out of the problem.
Exactly. Which leads directly to his assertion that the only remaining tool for the state is raw, unapologetic enforcement.
But if your entire solution relies on strict, unwavering enforcement, like threatening deportation for not working, you run headfirst into a massive logistical wall. Who is going to do the enforcing?
That's the question.
Because the transcript takes a very dark turn when it looks at the current reality of the police on the streets.
This is where Weird's grand sociological theories crash into the gritty, physical reality of the pavement in Amsterdam. He introduced a quote that is meant to serve as the ultimate indictment of state authority.
And the framing he uses here is designed to elicit maximum outrage. He cites a quote, allegedly from the general commander of the mobile unit, the riot police in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
According to the source, this commander stated that if his officers actually enforced minor infractions on the streets, specifically mentioning things like traffic offenses on fat bikes or teenagers giving the police the middle finger, it would ignite a literal war in the city.
We need to pause and define the fat bike phenomenon for a global audience because it sounds trivial, but it represents a profound breakdown in micro-enforcement.
Please do.
In the Netherlands, fat bikes are these heavy electric bicycles with thick tires that look almost like mopeds. They've become massively popular, particularly among urban youth, because they exploit a legal loophole. They go fast, but you don't need a helmet or a driver's license.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They become the primary vehicle for youth nuisance, speeding through pedestrian zones, causing accidents, and generally terrorizing the sidewalks. They're functionally uninsurable and heavily associated with a specific demographic of disruptive teenagers.
So the fat bike isn't just a bicycle. It is a symbol of exploiting the system with absolute impunity.
Exactly.
And the police chief is allegedly saying, if we try to stop these kids from breaking the rules, they will riot, and we cannot handle the riot. I was reading the transcript, and the way Weir reacts to this quote is staggering.
It really is.
He reaches back into the darkest, most traumatic moment in modern Dutch history to find a comparison. He compares this police attitude to May 1940.
For a Dutch commentator to invoke May 1940 is to press the ultimate psychological button. That is the month and year the Netherlands capitulated to the invading army of Nazi Germany.
Right.
It is the defining moment of national surrender, helplessness, and the loss of sovereignty.
To compare a police force choosing not to ticket a teenager on an electric bike to the capitulation of the nation to Adolf Hitler is hyperbole on an astronomical scale. It is almost absurd on its face.
It is deeply hyperbolic, but we have to examine why he uses that specific emotional payload. We're just trying to communicate that the surrender of sovereignty doesn't always happen with tanks crossing a border.
Okay.
Sometimes it happens when the state voluntarily relinquishes its monopoly on violence and order. He is arguing that if the riot police of the ultimate physical manifestation of the state's authority are terrified of enforcing basic civil codes because they fear the reaction of street gangs, then the state has already been conquered from within. He calls it hoisting the white flag.
And the psychological impact on the youth in those neighborhoods must be profound. I mean, if you are a teenager pushing the boundaries and you read in the newspaper that the chief of the riot police is afraid of starting a war with you, you essentially realize you're the one in charge.
You own the streets?
You have absolute free reign. The state has blinked.
It's the ultimate confirmation of impunity. But Weir doesn't just leave the critique at police cowardice. He juxtaposes this physical surrender with what he views as an unbearable institutional hypocrisy.
Oh, the pride flag paradox.
Yes, he sets up a scene that he calls the pride flag paradox.
This is one of the most vivid, almost cinematic moments in the transcript. Weir describes driving through parts of Amsterdam. He paints a picture of severe urban decay garbage, piling up uncollected, rats running through the streets, a total absence of sanitation and basic order. And right in the middle of this filth, he sees a municipal enforcement vehicle. This is the car driven by the local officers whose literal job description is to maintain livability and hand out fines. And plastered across the side of this vehicle is a massive LGBTQ+ pride flag.
The visual of the rat-infested street against the brightly colored progressive messaging on the state vehicle is the entire core of his rage. We need to explore the psychology of why this specific image triggers such a profound reaction from the speaker.
Well, if we think about the basic social contract, the state's primary function is safety and sanitation. It's the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Pick up the trash, catch the bad guys.
Exactly.
The basics. Weird is looking at this scene and seeing a fire department that has shown up to a burning building, but instead of unrolling the hoses, the firefighters are standing in the yard planting a sign about carbon emissions. It is a total insulting disconnect between the foundational duty of the institution and the ideological messaging it chooses to prioritize.
You've hit on the exact nerve. The source views this as the state engaging in performative virtue signaling while actively abandoning its practical mandate. But Weird pushes this critique deeper into the actual minds of the municipal employees driving those cars.
How so?
He asks us to consider the ethical dilemma of the worker. Imagine you are a practically educated municipal enforcer. Maybe you're politically neutral. Maybe you're a deeply conservative Christian or a devout traditional Muslim.
Okay.
You took this job to write parking tickets and manage waste. But your employer, the government, forces you to operate a vehicle that acts as a mobile billboard for a specific socio-political movement that you might fundamentally disagree with.
The government is essentially saying, this flag represents the neutral baseline of morality in our society.
Exactly. And that is the danger Weird highlights. By declaring a highly specific, progressive social cause as the neutral default, the state automatically labels any citizen or employee who feels uncomfortable with it as a deviant, a reactionary, or a bigot.
Wow, yeah.
Weird argues that the state is fiercely aggressively brave when it comes to adopting progressive aesthetics, but completely cowardly when it comes to confronting actual physical danger on the streets. The pride flag on the municipal car is viewed as a shield, a way for the institution to say, look how good and moral we are, while simultaneously turning a blind eye to the Moroccan youth on fat bikes tearing up the pavement.
It creates this immense pressurized disconnect. You have a managerial elite that prioritizes ideological aesthetics and a working class, the people actually walking the rat-infested streets who feel completely abandoned.
Yes.
And this hyper-local breakdown in Amsterdam serves as the perfect launch pad for the transcript to go global. Because Weir and his co-hosts argue that this exact same disconnect, this exact same ideological capture, is happening in the mainstream media regarding international reporting.
The transition in their argument is seamless. If the local government is systematically lying to itself about the reality of integration and street safety, they argue, then the global media institutions are systematically lying to the world about complex geopolitics.
And to build this case, they bring in a very specific voice, Matty Friedman. He is a former journalist and editor for the Associated Press, the AP. The transcript uses Friedman's essays and inside knowledge as the absolute bedrock for their claim that modern journalism is broken.
Matty Friedman's critiques, which were published several years ago, fundamentally alter how one views the mechanics of international news. He didn't just complain about bias, he pointed to structural logistical realities.
Right.
His biggest revelation was regarding the sheer density of reporters. He pointed out that the AP's Jerusalem bureau was massively overstaffed. At one point, the AP had more staff covering Israel and the Palestinian territories than they had covering all of sub-Saharan Africa or all of China.
Think about the pure statistical absurdity of that. Africa is a massive continent with ongoing civil wars, famine, immense economic shifts, and billions of people. China is a global superpower reshaping the world order. And yet, the premier global news agency decides to concentrate an overwhelming plurality of its resources on a strip of land smaller than New Jersey. Why? What are the structural incentives driving that massive misallocation of journalistic resources?
The transcript, leaning on Friedman, suggests it's driven by an insatiable ideological demand for a very specific narrative. The reporters sent to the Jerusalem Bureau are not there to uncover new facts. They are there to service an existing appetite.
Okay.
Friedman argued that the journalists had fundamentally shifted their mission from objective observation to ideological activism. They arrived with a preconceived narrative of the conflict, and their daily reporting was simply an exercise in reverse engineering the events on the ground to perfectly fit that narrative.
And the transcript doesn't just make broad accusations. They go after very specific, high-profile examples to prove this point. They systematically deconstruct 4 major media narratives surrounding the current conflict in Gaza.
Yes, they do.
And again, to you listening, our role right now is to unpack the source's critique of these events, to understand how they view the media apparatus functioning.
The first example they cite is the widespread media practice of instantly broadcasting casualty numbers provided by the Gaza Health Ministry. The source argues that this ministry is entirely controlled by Hamas.
Right.
To the speakers in the transcript, the fact that prestigious Western newspapers treat a designated terrorist organization as a reliable, objective statistical agency is the definition of journalistic malpractice. They argue the media wouldn't accept casualty numbers directly from ISIS without immense caveats, yet they do it daily in Gaza because the numbers serve the preferred narrative of asymmetrical oppression.
The second example is perhaps the most explosive sex with the Al-Ali Arab Hospital explosion. When that explosion happened, the initial shockwave through the global media was instantaneous. Major outlets sent out push notifications and printed headlines stating that an Israeli airstrike had deliberately targeted a hospital, killing hundreds.
The global outrage was immediate.
Embassies were protested, diplomatic summits were canceled.
But the source points out that within days, multiple Western intelligence agencies, independent open-source analysts, and eventually the media outlets themselves concluded that the explosion was almost certainly caused by a misfired rocket launched from within Gaza by Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Right. The narrative flipped completely.
And the speakers in the transcript don't just view this as an honest mistake in the fog of war. They point to the velocity of the error. They argue that editors at places like the New York Times or the BBC were so deeply primed to believe the absolute worst about Israel that all editorial standards, all requirements for verification were instantly suspended. The narrative fit perfectly, so they printed it without checking.
It is the ultimate confirmation bias happening in real time on the front page of the paper of record. The third example they use focuses on emotional manipulation. They discuss a specific, heartbreaking photograph published by the New York Times of an emaciated, starving girl used as the definitive visual proof of a deliberate famine orchestrated in Gaza.
The source claims that investigative follow-ups revealed a deeply different reality. They argue the girl in the photograph actually suffered from a rare, severe genetic disease that prevented her body from absorbing nutrients, leading to her condition.
Oh, whoa.
Furthermore, the source claims her immediate family members were photographed appearing healthy and well-fed. If this claim is accurate, the source argues it represents a grotesque manipulation by the photographer and the editors.
It suggests a willingness to exploit a child's unrelated medical tragedy to manufacture outrage and visually support the predetermined famine narrative. And the final example is a direct attack on the media's own self-mythologizing. The transcript aggressively challenges the frequently cited statistic that over 200 journalists have been killed in Gaza during the conflict.
This is where their critique becomes brutally cynical. The speakers argue that the Western definition of a free press simply does not exist under Hamas rule. They assert that anyone functioning with a camera or a press badge in Gaza is either directly employed by the militant infrastructure, operating under their absolute lethal oversight, or actively participating in operations. They note the dark irony that many of these individuals are immediately claimed and celebrated as militant martyrs by Hamas or Islamist Jihad the moment they're killed, only to be eulogized as heroic objective reporters by press freedom organizations in New York or London.
If you string all four of these examples together, the transcript is building a massive indictment. They're arguing that the lens through which the West consumes information about the Middle East is not just flawed, it's intentionally and permanently distorted.
Yes.
And the source actually coins a brand new term to describe this specific ideological lens. They call it Gazology.
Gazology. It's a brilliant piece of rhetorical framing. It elevates a regional conflict into an entire academic and philosophical discipline.
I love when we get a new piece of vocabulary to dissect. So if we look at the architecture of their argument, what exactly is the definition of Gazology?
The source posits that for the modern, university-educated youth in the West, the conflict in Gaza has transcended geopolitics. It has become what they call a civilizational break.
A civilizational break.
To understand the weight of that, you have to look at older generations in Europe. For the post-war generation, the Holocaust and the horrors of World War II were the civilizational break. That event was the absolute, unmovable baseline of good versus evil. Everything in society was measured against the promise of never again.
It was the ultimate moral compass setting. I mean, if a political movement looked even slightly like 1930s fascism, society universally rejected it.
Exactly. But Weird argues that for the current generation coming of age on college campuses, the memory of WWII has faded into abstraction. Gaza has replaced it as the foundational moral touchstone.
I see.
In the framework of Gazology, Israel is stripped of all historical and regional complexity and cast purely as the ultimate avatar of white, Western capitalist colonial oppression. Consequently, the Palestinians are cast as the ultimate pure victims of global systemic injustice.
Let me try an analogy here to see if I'm grasping the mechanics of this. Imagine you are given a pair of high-tech augmented reality glasses, the kind that overlays digital data onto the real world.
Sure.
But these specific glasses only have one permanent, unchangeable filter: the Gaza conflict. You walk outside wearing these glasses and you look at a climate change protest. The glasses instantly filter the data, telling you that carbon emissions are a function of the same Western colonial capitalism that oppresses Gaza.
Right.
You look at a feminist rally or a debate over LGBTQ rights or a discussion on global banking, and the glasses aggressively force you to view every single one of those incredibly complex, localized issues through the exact same binary oppressor versus oppressed framework of the Middle East.
That analogy perfectly captures the totalizing nature of the ideology the source is describing. Gazology isn't about understanding the Middle East. It is a universal theory of everything. Activists in London or Amsterdam aren't really analyzing the granular, messy reality of the Levant. They are using Gaza as a blank canvas to project their own domestic grievances against Western institutions, capitalism, and traditional power structures. It is a modern parable of good and evil that can be conveniently mapped onto any domestic issue they care about.
But this totalizing theory leads to a massive, glaring contradiction, and the transcript spends a significant amount of time picking it apart. It's a contradiction that honestly requires some heavy intellectual lifting to understand.
It really does.
If Gazology is the new universal lens, why does it appeal to such vastly different, frankly terrifyingly opposed political extremes?
This is where the transcript delves into the deep psychology of political extremism. They describe the formation of an unholy trinity of anti-Semitism, a temporary, cynical alliance between the far left, the far right, and Islamic extremists, all united around the singular focus on Israel.
If I am looking at a political spectrum, the far left and the far right are supposed to be mortal enemies. They fundamentally disagree on human nature, economics, and social structure. How do they end up marching in the same direction on this specific issue? Walk me through the psychological mechanics for each group, starting with the left.
According to the analysis in the transcript, the far left arrives at this position through the lens of Marxist class struggle and post-colonial theory. They view Israel, and by extension, the concept of Jewish success as the ultimate manifestation of capitalism and colonial privilege.
Okay, so it's about power dynamics.
Exactly. In their framework, the West is evil because it is powerful and wealthy, and Israel is the outpost of that Western power. Therefore, dismantling Israel is viewed as the first crucial domino in dismantling global capitalism and systemic inequality.
So for the left, it is fundamentally a class and race warfare dynamic. They're fighting the oppressor. Now, flip to the complete opposite side of the spectrum. What is the mechanism driving the far right into this alliance?
The far right's alignment is entirely divorced from post-colonial theory. Their participation is rooted in deep historical demographic conspiracy theories. The source explicitly points to the Great Replacement theory.
Right, the demographic replacement idea.
Elements of the far right genuinely believe that a shadowy, globalist Jewish elite is orchestrating mass immigration from the developing world into Western countries. The perceived goal is to intentionally dilute and undermine white Christian demographics and culture. So when the far right engages in anti-Zionism, it's rooted in a paranoid fear of demographic replacement and a hatred of perceived globalist control.
And the third pillar of this unholy trinity:
Islamic extremists. This pillar is driven by traditional, deeply theological anti-Semitism that spans centuries, supercharged by modern territorial disputes. The speaker in the transcript highlights the absolute horrific irony of this situation.
It's quite the trio.
If you put a far-left queer activist, a far-right white nationalist, and an Islamic fundamentalist in a locked room, they would theoretically try to destroy each other because their core values are violently incompatible. Yet, Gazology provides the precise psychological focal point where their distinct hatreds perfectly overlap.
This overlap produces some of the most bizarre political visuals of our time. And the host in the transcript points directly to one specific movement that breaks their brain: Queers for Palestine. For the commentators, this movement is the absolute pinnacle of ideological delusion.
It's the moment where the augmented reality glasses you mentioned earlier completely blind the wearer to physical reality.
They point out the glaring, fatal irony. The activists marching with rainbow flags through the streets of Amsterdam or London in support of militant groups like Hamas are supporting an ideology that would violently execute them the second they stepped foot in the territory. The transcript references the internet meme, chickens for KFC, to describe how thoroughly detached from self-preservation this activism has become. If you are a listener right now, try to wrap your head around the cognitive dissonance required to champion a regime that criminalizes your very existence.
But the source isn't just making a cheap internet joke. They are making a profound, deeply serious historical argument. They argue that this modern, seemingly absurd activism is following an exact, predictable, and highly destructive historical blueprint. They compare these modern campus activists directly to the Marxist-Leninist terror groups of the 1970s.
They specifically name-drop the Red Army faction in Germany, the Baader-Meinhof group.
Yes. If you look at the demographics of the Baader-Meinhof group, they were not working-class laborers. They were affluent, highly educated, university-trained Western leftists. They convinced themselves that the capitalist state in West Germany was structurally identical to fascism, and they declared a literal violent war against it.
And where did they get their training?
Well, where did these educated European leftists go to get military training? They flew to the Middle East to training camps run by the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Unbelievable.
The source is arguing that the ideological pipeline from the Western University to Middle Eastern militant solidarity was built 50 years ago. Today's activists are just walking down the same path.
And the transcript offers a really grim, bloody historical warning about where that path ultimately leads. They ask the modern progressive activists to look very closely at the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
The 1979 revolution is the ultimate cautionary tale of the useful idiot. In the late 70s, the movement to overthrow the Shah of Iran was incredibly diverse. You had the Islamic fundamentalists led by Ayatollah Khomeini, but you also had massive participation from secular leftists, communists, socialists, and student unions.
Right, it was a massive coalition.
The leftists believed they were engaging in a shared anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist revolution. They thought they could use the religious fervor to topple the dictator and then steer the new country toward a socialist utopia.
They thought they were in control of the narrative, but what actually happened the second the Shah fled the country?
The very instant the Islamic fundamentalists consolidated their grip on the state security apparatus, the alliance ended. The fundamentalists systematically rounded up the Marxist academics, the communist organizers, and the secular feminists who had just helped them win the revolution. They lined them up against the wall and executed them by the thousands. The source is explicitly warning movements like Queers for Palestine that they are actively volunteering for the exact same suicidal historical pattern. They are acting as a temporary, useful tool for a fundamentalist ideology that ultimately views them as an abomination to be eradicated.
It is a staggering historical parallel. To wrap up this massive theoretical block, the expert in the transcript tries to distill this entire irrational mindset down to a single psychological concept. They call it an I-day fix, an obsession.
An I-day fix?
It's this overwhelming, blinding desire to force physical reality to neatly fit your academic political theory, regardless of the obvious contradictions and regardless of the body count.
And the final historical analogy the source uses to illustrate this I-day fix is absolutely chilling. They pull an example from Mao Zedong's rule in communist China. Mao, sitting in his palace, developed a theory.
Okay.
He observed that sparrows were eating a portion of the grain harvest. His Marxist centrally planned logic dictated that if you eliminate the sparrows, you maximize the grain for the proletariat. So he ordered the entire population of China to eradicate the sparrows.
He had a theory, and he forced the physical world to bend to it.
Exactly. The population complied. Millions of sparrows were killed.
Yeah.
But Mao, blinded by his ideological theory, completely failed to understand the complex biological ecosystem. The sparrows didn't just eat grain, they were the primary predator of locusts. With the sparrows gone, the locust population exploded to biblical proportions, swarmed the fields, and devoured every single crop. The resulting ecological collapse contributed to a famine that starved tens of millions of people to death.
The theory was mathematically perfect on a chalkboard, and it resulted in mass death in reality.
That is the exact warning the source is delivering regarding Gazology. They are arguing that modern progressive activists are attempting to forcefully eradicate the immense complexities of geopolitics, history, and human nature to fit their neat binary Marxist theory of oppressor and oppressed. The force believes that these activists are completely blind to the societal and cultural ecosystem they're destroying, and that a collapse will inevitably follow.
Okay, that is an incredibly heavy, dense synthesis of global ideology. We have traveled from police surrendering on fat bikes to the structural economics of the Associated Press, to the bloody betrayals of the Iranian Revolution, to the ecological hubris of Mao.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really need to take a breath and bring the focus back from these grand global theories down to the actual dirt and soil of the Netherlands. Because at the end of the day, all of these high-level political theories, these grand progressive ideals, they have to live somewhere. They have to be enacted in local towns.
Right. The ideological rubber eventually has to meet the municipal road. And the transcript transitions perfectly from the global abstraction of Gazology to the hyper-local, deeply contentious reality of Dutch migration policy.
They zero in on a very specific piece of legislation known as the spreading sweat, or the distribution law. To understand why this law is causing such a political earthquake, we have to look at the mechanics of the Dutch asylum system. The national government runs central asylum reception centers, the most famous being in a town called Ter Apel. But because of sustained high levels of migration, these national centers are catastrophically overflowing, people are sleeping on the grass outside, the system is fundamentally broken.
So, the national government, sitting in The Hague, looks at this crisis and devises a legislative solution, the distribution law. The mechanics of the law are simple but highly coercive. It mandates that every local municipality in the entire country, regardless of their size or local demographics, is legally forced to take in a specific quota of asylum seekers to relieve the pressure on the national system.
Let me flesh out a metaphor here to capture the local resentment. Imagine you live in a large apartment building. The landlord, the national government, has allowed a massive leak to develop in the main roof. Water is pouring into the hallways.
Okay.
Instead of fixing the roof, which would mean halting the flow of migration, the landlord passes a new rule. He mandates that every single tenant must leave their door open and place a bucket in their living room to catch the overflow. And if you refuse to put a bucket in your living room, the landlord will legally force his way in and put one there anyway. That is how the local municipalities view the distribution law.
It is the ultimate manifestation of top-down elite policy overriding local democratic consent. And the transcript focuses heavily on one specific municipality fighting back Westland. Westland is a fascinating region.
Tell me about Westland.
It is the beating heart of the Dutch agricultural export economy, famous for massive high-tech greenhouse complexes. It's a culturally distinct, hardworking, somewhat insular community, and the local government of Westland is fighting tooth and nail, using every legal maneuver available to resist the national mandate to build an asylum center.
The speakers in the transcript, Weert and his colleagues, cheer for Westland's resistance. They view the local politicians fighting the mandate as heroes. And in defending Westland, the transcript reveals a very stark, unfiltered hierarchy of how these commentators view different categories of migrants. They absolutely refuse to treat migration as a single, monolithic issue.
They apply a very ruthless, pragmatic matrix to migration. For example, the transcript notes that Ukrainian refugees are viewed highly favorably. Why? The speaker points out that Ukrainians integrate rapidly into the labor force. They possess a fierce work ethic, they frequently return home for holidays to maintain ties, and crucially, they are deemed culturally compatible with the European framework. Their presence in a town does not cause massive social friction.
But the tone shifts violently when the source discusses other specific demographics. They repeatedly name-drop Syrian and Somali populations. They don't view these groups through a humanitarian lens. They view them strictly through an economic and cultural deficit lens.
Yeah, entirely economic.
They characterize these groups as an immense drain on social resources, citing incredibly high sustained unemployment rates, sometimes hovering around 60 to 70%, even after years in the country. Weert argues that they fundamentally destabilize the social cohesion of local towns without contributing to the economic engine.
And this creates a massive ideological collision. The progressive elites in the national government argue that migration is a humanitarian obligation and an economic necessity for an aging continent. The local working class argues that certain types of migration are culturally destructive and economically parasitic.
Right.
And whenever this argument happens, someone from the elite class always throws out the ultimate trump card. They say, well, if you don't want foreign labor in the greenhouses, just have the local Dutch unemployed people do the work.
Oh, man. This brings us to what is arguably the most vividly hilarious yet deeply depressing anecdote in the entire transcript. It perfectly encapsulates everything the source hates about the managerial elite. We have to talk about the 2012 greenhouse experiment.
It is the perfect micro-study of what happens when a spreadsheet collides with physical reality.
Okay, let's set the scene. It is 2012. You have a local politician in the city of The Hague, specifically a Weethouder. For our international listeners, a Weethouder is like an alderman or a municipal executive. They are the managerial
The
class.
spreadsheet guys.
Exactly. This Weethouder looks at his spreadsheets and realizes he has two distinct problems. Problem a high number of unemployed Dutch citizens living on benefits in The Hague. Problem B, massive greenhouses a few miles away in Westland that are desperate for manual labor, but currently rely on Polish migrant workers.
To the weed outer sitting in his climate-controlled office, the solution is mathematically beautiful. You take the people from problem A, move them to problem B, and you solve both issues instantly while reducing reliance on foreign labor. It's perfectly rational, progressive policy.
On paper, it is brilliant on paper. So the city enacts this plan. They charter a bus to take the unemployed locals from the city to the agricultural heartland. Now, the speaker in our transcript, Weir, was a field reporter at the time, and he actually rode along on this maiden voyage.
Oh, this is the best part.
The imagery he paints of this bus ride is incredible. He describes stepping onto the bus at the crack of dawn. This is not a group of rugged, eager agricultural laborers. He specifically notes the presence of aging hippies with dreadlocks, people who've been entirely detached from the labor market for years, and individuals who clearly possess neither the intention nor the physical conditioning required for brutal manual labor.
And Weird makes a point to mention the olfactory experience.
Yes. He says the second you step on the bus, you are hit with the overwhelming smell of weed. So picture this. It is 6 a.m., you have a bus full of stoned hippies and profoundly unenthusiastic locals being driven out to the countryside to pick tomatoes in a humid 90-degree glass box. Anyone who has ever done a day of real physical labor knows exactly how the story ends.
What happens when the spreadsheet meets the greenhouse?
Total, instantaneous collapse. Within 3 days, the entire multi-million-euro project is abandoned. Almost none of the locals show up after the agonizing physical pain of the first day. The greenhouse farmers, who have quotas to meet and produce rotting on the vine, throw their hands up in despair.
Naturally.
They immediately fire the locals and go right back to hiring the Polish migrants. Why? Because, as the source bluntly points out, the Polish migrants actually want to work. They have the physical stamina and the economic incentive to endure the labor.
We need to analyze what Weird is trying to communicate with this specific story. It isn't just a funny anecdote about lazy hippies. It's a profound structural critique of the university-educated administrative elite. The Weethouder failed because he believed human beings were just interchangeable widgets that could be moved between columns on a spreadsheet.
Great.
He completely ignored the messy, unavoidable realities of culture, work ethic, physical endurance, and economic incentives. You cannot legislate a work ethic into existence.
And more importantly, you cannot manage a society purely from an abstract academic distance. The source argues that policies like the distribution law forcing asylum seekers into Westland are just the 2012 greenhouse experiment repeated on a massive, terrifying national scale. The elite government is once again trying to force incompatible populations into local municipalities, relying on abstract theories of multicultural harmony, while completely ignoring the inevitable social friction, the cultural clashes, and the fundamental reality that some populations simply will not integrate into the local ecosystem.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox of this entire transcript. We spent an hour outlining a worldview where everything is failing. The source believes integration is dead. The police have hoisted the white flag. The media is captured by radical ideology. The local towns are in open rebellion against national mandates. If all of this is true, or even if the electorate simply believes a fraction of it is true, a massive question remains.
The million-dollar question. How does the government keep getting away with it? If the policies are this disastrous, why do the people implementing them keep winning elections? Why doesn't the democratic immune system kick in and vote these people out?
To answer that, the transcript moves to its final, most crucial segment, the democratic disconnect. They attempt to explain exactly who actually rules the country and how the system is effectively rigged.
The transcript brings in research cited by a prominent right-wing politician named Martin Bosma. And the findings of this research serve as the master key that unlocks the deep structural political frustration of the speakers.
The research claims to have uncovered a terrifying mathematical reality about the Dutch democratic system. It analyzed decades of policy decisions and voter preferences. The conclusion is that in the Netherlands, the university-educated demographic, The academic elite, the managerial class, the people who work in NGOs and media always get their way on policy. Always, without exception.
That is an incredibly strong word, always. Whether it is a policy regarding the expansion of the European Union, the implementation of aggressive, expensive climate change measures, or the maintenance of high levels of immigration. If the university class wants it, it becomes law. But what about the rest of the country? What about the majority?
This is where the research gets devastating. It suggests that the practically educated, the working class, the tradespeople, the demographic, the Dutch affectionately call Jan Model, or the average Joe, they only ever see their preferred policies enacted if they happen to coincidentally agree with the university-educated elites.
Let's run a simulation of that. Let's say 80% of the working class wants to halt immigration because it's straining their local housing market. But the university class, sitting in their affluent, insulated neighborhoods, wants immigration to continue for humanitarian reasons. Who wins?
The university class wins every single time.
So it isn't a functioning democracy. It's a system where one specific, highly educated demographic holds a permanent structural veto over the majority.
That is exactly the architecture the source is describing. The elites maintain this veto because they control the machinery of the state. They staff the judicial courts, they write the international treaties that legally bind the government, they run the media networks that define acceptable discourse, and they operate the massive bureaucratic blob that actually implements policy.
So you can't even vote them out.
No, you can vote for a different politician, but you cannot vote out the administrative state.
If you are Jan Model and you realize the game is mathematically rigged against you, what do? You look for a political vehicle to fight back. You look for a champion. And the host in the transcript walks us through a graveyard of political parties that have failed the working class.
Historically, if you are an aggrieved working class citizen worried about wages and housing, your natural home is the Socialist Party, the SP, the classic old-school left-wing labor movement.
But the source notes that the SP completely imploded. Why? Because they refused to touch the third rail of European politics, the immigration issue. The working class was screaming from the rooftops, saying, "Fast immigration is undercutting our wages and fundamentally changing the culture of our neighborhood."
Right, they wanted protection.
But the SP leadership, deeply infected by the progressive, university-educated ideals of their affluent urban members, refused to address it. They labeled their own working class base as racist for bringing it up.
So, abandoned by the traditional left, the working class migrated across the spectrum. They went looking for a new vehicle, and they found the populist right. They flocked to Geert Wilders and the PVV.
And this is where the transcript gets incredibly relevant to the news today, because currently the Netherlands actually has a government heavily influenced by Wilders and the PVV. It is called the Schoof cabinet. So theoretically, the working class finally won. Their guy is in power.
But pay very close attention to the tone Weert uses when discussing this current cabinet. He does not view it as a victory. The speakers in the transcript view the current PVV-led government as a complete and utter failure. They view it as a project that has already capitulated and let down the practically educated base.
Why? Because the populist politicians finally got into the driver's seat, grabbed the steering wheel, and realized it wasn't connected to the engine.
Precisely. Weert suggests that the moment the populists entered government, they were instantly neutralized by the institutional blob. The civil servants dragged their feet, the courts blocked their policies citing European treaties, and the university-educated bureaucracy effectively neutered the populist agenda. The veto held strong.
Which leads to a deeply ironic and somewhat terrifying political twist at the very end of the transcript. The source notes that out of pure, unadulterated desperation, much of this working class anger is now abandoning the mainstream populace and flowing toward the FVD, the Forum for Democracy.
And we must point out the massive irony of this migration.
It is hilarious and tragic at the same time. The working class, furious at the university-educated elites, are flocking to the FVD. But the FVD is explicitly led by Thierry Baudet, a man who is the very caricature of a highly educated pseudo-intellectual elite. He famously gave his victory speeches in Latin. He plays the grand piano in his office. Why on earth is Jan Model voting for a guy quoting Roman philosophers?
Because the working class is no longer looking for policy wonks. They're looking for a wrecking ball. The FED, despite its elite aesthetics, is the only party left offering truly radical, burn-it-all-down rhetoric. They are the only ones promising to rip up the international treaties, defund the media, and dismantle the institutions.
Wow.
The working class doesn't care about the Latin. They care that the FED is willing to attack the very architecture of the state that Jan Model feels is suffocating him.
This specific dynamic, this desperate search for a radical vehicle, is not contained to the borders of the Netherlands. The expert in the transcript points out that this domestic Dutch frustration is just one fault line in a massive European earthquake.
They explicitly name-drop the massive populist movements across the continent. Marine Le Pen's National Rally in France, the AFD in Germany, Nigel Farage and the Reform Party in the UK.
The underlying mechanics are identical everywhere. You have a practically educated working class that feels entirely disenfranchised, ruled over by a university-educated managerial elite. This elite forces through massive society-altering policies, net zero climate goals that destroy agricultural livelihoods, open borders that strain local services, and deep European integration that erodes national sovereignty.
Yeah, all the big stuff.
And the working class feels they are the only ones forced to pay the tab, both financially and culturally. The rise of the AFD or Le Pen isn't some inexplicable anomaly or a sudden resurgence of 1930s fascism. It is a rational, if desperate, search by the working class for any political battering ram capable of smashing through the elite consensus.
And the profound, lingering pessimism of this transcript is the speaker's deep-seated belief that even these battering rams are going to fail. Weird and his colleagues end their conversation with a sense of fatalism. They believe the demographic shifts have gone too far, the institutions are too deeply captured by progressives, and the global narrative is too tightly controlled by gazology and the media to ever course correct. They view the entire system as terminally ill.
Wow. Okay. We need to take a massive step back. We have covered an astonishing amount of ground today.
We have mapped out a truly sprawling, incredibly hostile ideological terrain.
Let's summarize the journey we just took. We started with the innocent curiosity of a true crime podcast about North Korea, but the speakers use that as a trapdoor to plunge us into a diagnosis of a fatally fragmented tribal society where the social contract has been incinerated.
Right.
We looked at the perceived surrender of street-level law enforcement, epitomized by the pride flag paradox, the enraging image of a state that aggressively virtue signals its progressive credentials while cowardly abandoning its basic booty to keep the streets safe.
We then explored how that same elite disconnect is mirrored globally through the concept of gazology. We unpacked how the media, structurally incentivized to prioritize narrative over facts, uses the Middle East as a universal augmented reality filter. We examined how this flattens complex reality into a Marxist oppressor versus oppressed binary, creating an unholy trinity of extremists and echoing the dangerous suicidal alliances of the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
We brought it crashing back down to earth with the distribution law and the 2012 greenhouse experiment, showcasing the farcical, weed-scented reality of elite migration policies failing on contact with manual labor. And finally, we unpack the root cause of the entire crisis, a rigged democratic system where the university-educated hold a permanent structural veto over the working class, fueling a desperate, continent-wide search for a populist battering ram.
If you are listening to this right now, I want to emphasize why dedicating an hour to exploring this specific, highly critical worldview is so vital. You might be sitting there vehemently disagreeing with every single conclusion we're drew. You might find the comparison of a fat bike nuisance to the Nazi invasion of May 1940 to be offensive hyperbole. You might view his rhetoric on denaturalization as dangerous fear-mongering.
Sure.
But understanding how this worldview is constructed is non-negotiable if you want to understand the modern world. You must understand the specific historical grievances, the structural economic arguments, and the deep psychological resentment that fuels this narrative. You cannot debate, you cannot dismantle, and you certainly cannot defeat the populist waves currently sweeping across Europe if you refuse to understand the deep, structural, democratic disconnect that is powering it. Dismissing it as mere ignorance is a failure of analysis.
And that brings us all the way back to the beginning. We talked about how much we love a clean narrative. We love a true crime podcast where the bad guy is caught, the mystery is solved, and the world makes sense again. The speakers in this transcript are essentially grieving. They deeply lament the loss of a clean narrative for their own country.
Yeah, that's really what it is.
They mourn the loss of a unifying national identity that shared overarching umbrella that tells everyone what it means to belong to the society. But I want to leave you with a provocative final thought, a question that the transcript completely fails to address.
What's that?
Well, if we look at the forces Weir himself describes, if we live in an era of hyperconnectivity, of augmented reality, of algorithm-driven media that feeds us bespoke realities perfectly tailored to our existing biases, in an era of globalized outrage, is a national narrative even technologically possible anymore? Can any country, whether it's the Netherlands, the US, or France, ever go back to sharing a single umbrella? Or are we inevitably, irreversibly moving toward a future of global digital tribes? A future where you find you have infinitely more in common with someone sharing your exact political ideology halfway across the world than you do with your own neighbor living right across the street. Is the tribal society physitiveness? Weird Fear is not a failure of migration, but simply the inevitable final form of the internet age.
That is quite the thought.
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense, demanding journey today. Keep questioning the narratives you were handed, keep looking for the underlying mechanics of the arguments around you, and we will see you on the next deep dive.